Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the exciting day 2 of our workshop on cyber risk to financial stability. As we've said, this is the second event that we've done in this series, where we're trying to say, what are we learning? What's the new research? That's the panel that Anna Kovner covered yesterday. This morning panel on what are we doing? What are the concrete steps that are happening in the regulators, within financial institutions, at think tanks and academia, to address cyber risk to financial stability, to make ourselves better, so that we're going to be better today than we were yesterday, and better tomorrow than we are today. The role of today's panel, or this current panel, is to look forward and to say, all right, what next? Now, when we held our last session on this in April of 2019, none of us knew what 2020 held in store. And of course, we've had the pandemic, we've had a contested election, we've had, just as we talked about in the earlier panel, this major cyber incident from SolarWinds, this network management software. So we've had a lot of shocks since the last one. And so what we have done is we've really assembled some of the best folks that we could think about to look at what's next. And the main question that I asked our panelists to really think about is, will the next 5 post-pandemic years be roughly the same for cyber risk to financial stability? Or are they going to be so different that we have to drastically rethink the policies and solutions that we've been pursuing for the last 5 years, right? If we are going to have a central continuity, if the pandemic and the other shocks that we've had for 2020 are just the sort of thing that we can take in stride, and maybe they caused some panic and we all had to work from home and we had to wear masks and we had to be taking care of our kids from home, those that had them, and we can just take those in their strides. But the way that we budgeted, the assumptions that we made about what the world was going to be like in 2023, 2024, 2025, so that our policies that we're working on today in their interagency, that as the financial institutions are making are pushing through their budget for 2021, are these generally the right kinds of things that we need to be working on for cyber risk to financial stability? Or are the changes that are coming in the domestic environment, in the health environment, in the international security environment for overall financial stability, have there been fundamental shifts that are going to force significant rethinks? And so I'll do the bios as I introduce each of the panelists. But I really want to start with my former boss and colleague, Barry Pavel at the Atlantic Council. Now, Barry is running the Brent Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security there, and that includes their Strategic Foresight Initiative. So a lot of the ways that I've been trying to, that I've picked up working for him, structured ways of thinking about the future and how that's going to affect Homeland Security, national security, and many other areas I picked up from Barry and from his team. And so Barry, I was hoping that you can lead us off here. What's the current thinking right now about what those next 5 years are going to be like? And when we come back, I might ask you about how you see the Biden transition team coming into that, but I think we'll hold off on that for now.
Okay.
Yeah, no, please, Barry, go ahead.
Okay, do you want me to address that right now?
Yes, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks a lot, Jay. Really appreciate you inviting me to this. I'll try to be brief. In the Scowcroft Center, as you said, we try to look ahead, develop strategies and forward-looking assessments. I'll just highlight a few key things that I think might be relevant as context. First, we're living in a slow motion historic strategic shock that's still playing out. And so number one about that, those who say it's not changing much, I think they're missing a few things, and that there might be some very significant secondary and tertiary shocks that are still unfolding. That's number one. Number two on that, you know, you asked about the post-pandemic years, and I think we all think that's happening, but we don't know yet. The virus is mutating, the experts tell me. We hope the vaccines will do the job, but this is new territory. And there was even a poll this morning that I saw showing 49% of Republicans and double-digit percentages of other groups, including other particular groups, don't trust that the vaccine will be effective and don't plan to get vaccinated. So will some countries be out of this and some remain kind of mired in it? We also saw this morning that the World Economic Forum will announce that they will convene in the Singapore bubble in June, for example. Second major factor, I think, is that we're living in a new era of history since well before the virus. It was my sense that the main geopolitical factor, the United States' role, changed in 2013 when President Obama did not follow up on his declaratory threat. This is relevant because it was the first time I heard allies asking, what does this mean about the alliance with the United States? It's the first time hedging began. And so this is the biggest factor, and we can talk about the Biden administration role in that. Next, I think authoritarian regimes have been stepping into these spaces, and I'll bring this home to what I think is the topic here, where they perceive the US as less present. Those leaders' power positions are threatened by the democratic model, by openness, et cetera. And so they're now responding the way most countries did throughout history. It's normal geopolitical behavior. It means the chances of major war are returning. The authoritarian mafia regimes in Russia and China see it in their interest to weaken democracies, to aggrandize themselves, to coerce and to occupy territory. They want to destabilize the United States and US allies. China in particular, by the pandemic, has been greatly changed its role, its self-perception. Xi Jinping, first of all, is a very different leader than any of his predecessors. He has popularized the view that the China's ability to handle the pandemic domestically, which, don't forget, started in China, has proven the superiority of the Chinese model for the world. And so the nationalist kind of fever is being whipped up from what I understand from the Chinese experts whom I speak with. So a piece of this is that the Chinese and Russian leaders see themselves at war with the United States right now, and this is a non-kinetic war. It includes cyber among tools like influence operations, information operations, covert operations, all aimed at weakening the US polity and heightening fractures in our society in the US homeland right now. And so, most Americans don't feel this or think this, but certainly, officials in DHS, the FBI, and other agencies do think this. And, this non-kinetic war will play out in ways that affect financial stability. Look at the SolarWinds hack that you mentioned, Jay. Imagine that's directed at financial institutions. Is that not possible? Could that not happen tomorrow? So while this is kind of a new great power competition, it won't be won by militaries, but in types of realms, that are the topic of this conference. So to conclude very briefly, I see three scenarios, geopolitically that include non-state actors. So I'm not only focusing on state, but you could see a scenario where China does ascend, and this comes from Matt Burrow's work at the Scowcroft Center. China does ascend. It's, we call it China first. They start to really pull out of the gate. And so this would be a conflictual, very challenging world for democracies, including the United States. We would push back and we would try to avert crises, et cetera. You could see a Biden team come in and look for strong areas of cooperation with China where it's needed. And you could talk about the long list, including cyberspace. And so if the Biden team works with allies and looks to cooperate with China where appropriate, you'll have what we've called a new renaissance, where we'll be, really, advancing all together. And then I think the third scenario is something in between, where there's, quite a bit of competition, maybe the occasional crisis, but also a few areas where there is cooperation. I'll end by saying, just because of the dynamism in a number of fields, that shocks are much more likely now. I predicted this in a paper in April of 2015. And so they will be more frequent. So how is financial stability being postured and taking that calculus into account? And I think I'll end there.
Yeah, thanks. And we had worked together on the Zurich work at the Atlantic Council that was looking at those shocks, and we'll try and put those links. If you send us the link to your paper, we'll put it in the chat. And it reminds me of what Jason Whitty had talked about this morning from JP Morgan, right? He was saying that cyber financial stability, one of the things that makes it different is, if you have a cyber failure, if you have a run on a bank, banks are kind of used to those risks, but those risks aren't planned with maliciousness in mind. Like they don't have a smart adversary on the other side, usually that is thinking about when to hit. They're not more likely to happen because an adversary wills it. And so in the situation you're talking about, the administration would put it in terms of great power competition, that if we are expecting more conflict between the democracies and authoritarian governments, and frankly, potentially even in between democracies, right? A breakdown of the general governance mechanisms like the G7 and even NATO, even the EU, that if we're seeing more of that conflict, that we could expect that to play out in ways that would affect financial stability.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jay. If that was directed at me, you've seen a little bit of this, in the Trump administration, or quite a bit of it actually, where there's this, what I would call geopolitical distance between and among the United States and other democracies, and lots of areas where this group knows quite well, how that's played out. To what extent will the Biden administration go back in the other direction? I think there's a strong expectation, almost, resetting back, but I'm not sure that's going to be the case. There's a lot of challenges in front of this administration, and I do think you might still see some of that sort of, not necessarily conflict among democracies, but diverging views, and the pull of the Chinese economy is quite convincing in many cases.
Yeah, it reminds me of the phrase we heard a lot in the 2008 timeframe that banks live globally but die locally. Once things start to happen, and then those national borders pop up, and I wonder what that means in the terms of here, where what might happen on the internet. Also, one other quick question. I know every 4 years, the National Intelligence Council would put out a new global trends report for the new president. Are they doing a new, do you know they're doing a new global trends?
I think they've done an effort, but it's not nearly as kind of high profile as in the past. And we're doing our own.
Okay.
We'll release this week actually.
Oh, great.
Top 10 global risks and opportunities for 2021. I think it's actually being released later today, and we can send that to the
great. That'd be great. And for those that don't know, the National Intelligence Council is the top level of analysts within the U.S. Intelligence system. And so they do this work on what are the coming trends so that the president, the incoming president will know. And like, for example, are they where more mitigate migration, climate change, and the rest. And so if you're working on long-term plans, it's a great document, and the work that Barry Pavel and Matt Burrows has done has always been a great compliment. So Barry, thanks for that. And I wanted to start with that because you're giving us the big picture, but I know you're not as deep into cybersecurity or financial stability, certainly as our next speakers. And I wanted to go to Jeremy Brotherton next, because you are, you're hardcore computer scientist and cybersecurity. I mean, you've been within the Federal Reserve System in one way or another for what, 13 years now, on the national incident response side, of looking at, responding to the threats, thinking about what new threats are coming up, and how you ought to respond. And so I was hoping if you could pick it up from there. Barry gave this very general, or this more general sense. So what specific threats are you imagining coming up in 2021 in the next couple of years, both against your own systems and how those might affect financial stability?
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this forum. The content's been really informative so far, and certainly thought-provoking. As you noted, I think my perspective is probably a little bit more operationally focused with my role, but hopefully gives some insights into maybe some of the threats and challenges facing cyber defenders today, and that looking forward. I do need to note that my comments today are reflective of my personal opinions and not representative of the Federal Reserve. So there were kind of two aspects to your question, Jay. So first, let me tackle my perspective around the threats to our own system, and then I'll come back around to the sector more broadly. I think you'll find that the threats that we face as an organization are pretty similar to those across the sector and across any large enterprise organizations. But I think in some cases, there may be some unique aspects to what we do. So maybe I'll offer some perspective around both. Like many others, sorry, it looks like my video froze.
We can still hear you.
Okay, great. Like many others, I think the pandemic pushed us to accelerate our digital transformation initiatives. We have about 3/4 of our workforce moved into a remote posture, except for some of the critical on-site essential operations. For us and most other organizations, cloud solutions and other productivity features like video conferencing have been core as an element to addressing some of those changing business needs from the pandemic from 2020. Well, I think cloud has a lot of upside when it comes to security. The reality is this really comes down to how well an organization can control its use. And I'll come back to this topic as I focus on that second aspect of your question. The second area I see on the horizon for our own systems is really driven by new business endeavors. Specifically, I'm referring to our efforts to develop a service for instant payments, which is due to launch in 2023 or 2024. So transitioning to a 24/7, 365 payment operations is a departure from our more traditional settlement services that are aligned to core business hours. I think this change in the business model will bring with it a change in threats we see as our attack surface evolves with this new endeavor. The second aspect of your question was really around the sector more broadly. So the first area that I want to touch on again was around cloud. There's been a steady trickle of headlines about cloud in recent years, but I think the question to me, which I wonder, is when or even if there will be some sort of a defining moment for cloud as we've seen in other ways. So in 2010, Google was the first major corporation to publicly disclose it was the victim of a nation state cyber attack. I think this is when the idea of an advanced persistent threat, or APT, really became mainstream outside of the government. In 2016, and we've heard this mentioned in the conference already, the attempted theft of nearly $1 billion from Bangladesh Bank was certainly a defining moment for the sector. It was a massive digital bank robbery, to put it simply. In 2019, we've seen distributed denial of services attacks against AWS with their Route 53 service. This caused outages that lasted for almost 8 hours. Just last month, right before Thanksgiving, they also had a significant outage in one of their regions that impacted businesses for the better part of a day in that case. But the cause there was really just a routine change to add capacity from a business perspective. Undoubtedly, cloud providers invest heavily and focus on security, but I think the implications of a successful exploit in its core infrastructure could be pretty tremendous. Additionally, I think the ubiquitous adoption of cloud across organizations, and specifically the financial sector, means we now have some of those single points of failure that could have that wide-reaching effect if successfully attacked. I think digitalization efforts will continue accelerating post-pandemic. Third-party providers broadly, such as cloud service providers, almost certainly will be an increasing area of risk. The second area that I see broadly for the financial sector is around ransomware, something we heard about earlier today. In the opening comments, we heard about FSISAC, and just last month, they published a note on this threat, really pointing out specifically in the prior 4 months, there were successful operations or claims of successful operations against at least 8 financial institutions, I think a handful of those being within the United States. Last week, we also saw a payment processor for a significant number of issuing banks in North America and Europe suffer from one of these attacks. But fortunately, in that case, they've reported no impacts to those transaction processing systems. This isn't unique to the financial sector. Healthcare is front and center from a pandemic perspective, has arguably been one of the other sectors most impacted by this threat. In September, we heard reports of a German hospital suffering a ransomware attack, which caused patients to be diverted to nearby hospitals. And it's believed that one patient died as a result of that. So this is sort of a first human death reported from a ransomware attack, if in fact those two are really related. And I think it's pretty alarming how quickly the threat from ransomware has grown in the past 12 to 18 months. I've seen some estimates that it's a 3 to 4-fold increase, and with such success, I wouldn't anticipate that this trend is easing anytime soon. There's been a dramatic shift in the capabilities of these adversaries and their ability to conduct more targeted attacks. Ransomware was really originally executed through a shotgun approach, indiscriminately targeting victims for a few $100s to just crypt their files. Now these adversaries are shifting to more targeted intrusions. They operate more covertly. They're stealing corporate data for extortion and demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in ransom to recover the data, or else face the risk of public disclosure, or in some cases, both. So my two thoughts sort of to your question as I think forward is, will we see a substantial attack on cloud infrastructure that has large, widespread impact across the financial sector? And will we see a ransomware attack that has cascading impacts across the financial sector, specifically with respect to payment systems? I think we had some great panelists earlier yesterday that spoke about some of their analysis of the interconnectedness and some of those cascading impacts. So those are my initial thoughts, Jay.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. I mean, I'm still working through, right, a major question. And this might just be because I'm in a dark mood because of 2020, right? When I hear Barry talk about the new challenges, right? And there's, you know, he said one of the scenarios is like a new renaissance, right? And it's hard to feel optimistic, right? And maybe it's just December, maybe it's just 2020. But it's easy to see the challenges that are going to be coming over the next couple of years. And you've kind of already covered this on cloud, but do you see important technical reasons for optimism? That if, boy, governance is going down, adversaries are going to probably be more risk-seeking, competition between great powers is likely to be more active. What can we as cybersecurity experts do to help redress that balance? Do you think that answers cloud? Are there other things there that we might be able to do at scale to give the defender the advantage over attackers?
Well, I think we've arguably had a lot of technology advances. Obviously, you know, artificial intelligence and machine learning are hot and heavy in the cyberspace as well. Really being able to apply, you know, significant computational resources to picking out and helping, you know, what had historically been, you know, sort of that human activity of, you know, finding a needle in a stack of needles, the right needle, you know, trying to do things which were sort of so human dependent. I think cloud certainly is a promising aspect from a technology perspective. I think some of the things that major organizations face, you know, is often that you have sort of this nature to sort of retrofit and improve the basic hygiene of the enterprise. You know, sort of it's this constant technological lift from a security perspective. You have new technologies that come out. Cloud is interesting in the sense for me that, you know, I think it offers so much promise sort of fundamentally built into the platform. So, you know, organizations having to tackle things like logging or security controls, a lot of these are native and inherent within the platform. And so I think in the case of cloud, it's really that focus on how organizations need to make sure they secure that, govern that, and make sure that the right security controls are in place. So I think there is a lot of hope in future from a technology perspective. Cloud absolutely is a place, I think, to sort of have it from the ground up for many enterprises. And I think that's why there's been a focus and push across, you know, financial financial services, certainly, and enterprises as a whole to take advantage of sort of what is natively available from there to really jumpstart that. I will say that, one particular area to sort of think about in cloud is if you're not an organization that's been thinking about that so far, I think the risk of being sort of left behind and sort of the gap growing between sort of the forward-leaning and those maybe perhaps smaller enterprises that haven't focused so much on that, can increasingly grow. And so that's something to just sort of think about what the implications of that might be as far as sort of targeting the weak of the herd.
It's funny. One of the biggest changes when I moved from Washington, D.C. to New York to come to Columbia, it was in Washington, the conversation was always the cloud is great, but with all of the reasons about why it wasn't as great as it was being made out. When I got to New York, the conversation was the cloud is great, and we haven't even begun to reap the majority of the security benefits that are there. Thank you very much for that. We have saved as our cleanup hitter, Allie Friedman, who's the Deputy Director of the Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection at Treasury. And I wanted her to go last so that she can react to the others, and especially because she's done both cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection issues at DHS as a senior policy advisor. And now being the Deputy Director of the main office at Treasury that's involved in these issues. And so, Allie, maybe you can expand on other points that have been made and help us think about how Treasury is going to be thinking about the next couple of years and how they might be different.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Trish, and everyone at SEPA and the New York Fed for inviting me to participate today. Just a bit of background about our office, OSIP. As Jay mentioned, it's the Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection. For those not familiar with our office, we are the office that fulfills the duties and responsibilities of Treasury as the sector-specific agency for the financial services sector, which basically means that we lead whole of government efforts to increase the cybersecurity and resilience of the financial sector's critical infrastructure. We operate at the nexus of the financial sector, national security, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure protection, and risk management. And really, we work closely with financial institutions, industry groups, the financial regulators, and other government partners across, law enforcement, homeland security, and intelligence to prioritize risk management and resilience activities within the sector and enable operationally relevant information sharing and collaboration. So to sort of back clean up, as you say, and sort of reflect on the presentations by other panelists this morning, I want to sort of go back to what Jason Whitty was talking about earlier, along with Greg Rattray, right? I mean, we have FSI SAC, we have FSARC, now the ARC, and those are really two foundational organizations within the sector that our office partners with. I co-chair the risk committee on the financial sector side at the ARC, right? And these are really venues that bring together the public and private sectors to think through, to work through issues. FSI SAC on the information sharing piece, FSARC really getting more into the operational collaboration, the systemic risk, and figuring out what we can do collectively, the regulators, Treasury, other government partners in the private sector to identify and mitigate systemic risk in the sector. So I think there are a lot of great venues that exist where we can really tackle some of these challenges. The pandemic and everything that we've done in 2020 has really put this into focus and really given us the opportunity to flex these muscles, right? How we can come together across the different industry associations, big institutions, small institutions, medium-sized institutions, and understand, what the impacts of the pandemic were, how the transition to remote operations is going, what the unique cyber threats that exist as the shift to remote operations took place. What does the return to normal operations look like? What are some of the challenges that might exist as folks start returning to the office, right, and working in person again in large office settings. And so, you know, we've had an opportunity to sort of work collaboratively. And I think that's exactly, you know, the message that I would have. Collaboration, the events of the last week and a half, right, underscore the challenges of third and fourth party risk, and, you know, what we need to be doing collectively to identify and mitigate those risks. And then, you know, to what Jeremy was just speaking about, ransomware as a key threat to the sector, understanding what are the things we can be doing to tackle this threat, both from a defensive standpoint, and then, you know, some of the organizations that exist in other sectors to help, you know, do disruptive operations. So all of this is to say, it really comes down to the public-private partnership and what we can do collectively. And so I think 2020, while it's been challenging, has been a really great opportunity for us to leverage the organizations that have existed for a long time to bring folks together to really tackle the challenges that we're facing.
Great, thanks. And it, you know, your comments really made me think of the, you know, Jason Whitty's comments earlier, as well as from the first panel, where it seems like we're rushing a lot more toward not just cloud, as we brought up with Jeremy, but also zero trust. And I think as moving towards this model, that I kind of associate in my head, thinking back to Google after they got hit by China in 2010, 2011 timeframe, of starting to Aurora, of starting to move towards zero trust. It certainly seems like we're accelerating that within the government and across the finance sector, as we're bringing in more untrusted devices into the network. And how can you trust a network that has fundamentally untrustworthy components? And it can be done. And I think Jason really stressed that this morning. So a question, I think this is predominantly going to be for Ali and Jeremy. You know, Ali, you'd mentioned in your comments about supply chain. And certainly if the last week has shown us anything, it's that the supply chain issues are going to be fundamentally more important over the next 5 years. And there's only been a few places where the defenders have had a generally easier time than the attackers. And like, for example, encryption, if you're doing encryption right, that's one of those that definitely really helps us. And I would say code signing, right? Code signing has been relatively easy to implement, and has given us a high degree of trust that this software that you can load and you can roll out to your environment. And now twice within the last couple of years, we've seen Russia taking advantage of code signing. First with NotPetya, exploiting the Ukrainian MEDOC code signing to push out their code. And now again with SolarWinds, Orion. And so, Ali, I don't know, do you have any comments about supply chain in general, or maybe what Treasury might be thinking about this in the next couple of years? And then Jeremy and Barry, I know Atlantic Council did a report on this recently. If you have anything to chime in additionally, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So, I mean, from a Treasury perspective, I mean, I think this is an area where we really need to partner with the other government agencies, right? Leveraging DHS, and specifically the National Risk Management Center, which DHS established a couple of years ago, which sits within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They have a supply chain task force, which is bringing together industry folks from across the ICT sectors, as well as other government partners, to really understand some of the specific challenges unique to the supply chain and what we can be doing collectively to address those challenges. Because of the dependencies that the financial sector has on, you know, the information technology, the communications, all the software that's coming out, you know, from other sectors, we really can't address this on our own, and we need to be able to partner with those other sectors and their sector-specific agencies to be able to work through these challenges. So I think, as it relates to, the next couple of years and the theme of this panel, right, that's going to be, I think, a key focus for us and for our partners across government, really trying to figure out how we can strengthen the supply chain and really do everything that we can with those critical sectors to mitigate some of the risks that exist within the supply chain.
I'll maybe add to the comments. I think that the notion of what you're sharing, Ali, and the opening comments that we heard, this collective defense, this collaboration, I think is incredibly key for some of these specifically challenging areas that we have. I mean, I think as you hit on the sort of nature of exploiting that trust relationship for supply chain and the way that they do that, certainly, code signing, all of those are great advances that we have from a security perspective, but they're not without risk. And, so you're sort of going back into the time machine here. We've seen sort of these attacks against anchors of trust, not just from a code signing perspective. We've seen this with multiple certificate authorities back in 2012, 2013-ish timeframe. Bit9, another cybersecurity firm, had some code signing certificates stolen, which were used in an attack against other entities. So we've certainly seen this, so it's not new, and I think it's one of the most challenging aspects that we have for defenders today. But I guess keeping with the theme and optimism here, FireEye has certainly published incredible technical details of some of the work that they've done, and I think one specific statement stands out to me. It can be detected. These adversaries are human in many cases. Mistakes are made. There's small lapses in perhaps operational security, and that, I think, gives us hope as cyber defenders.
That's great. Thank you. Barry, did you have any?
Yeah, at the Atlanta Council, we put out something over the summer called Breaking Trust, Shades of Crisis in an Insecure Software Supply Chain. It's worth looking at. There were sort of three clusters of recommendations. One was to strengthen the baseline and really try to reduce the burden of secure software supply chain management on developers and project owners. Second, better protect open source, which is such a critical and innovative ecosystem. And if that withers, if we can't support efforts to secure it, then that's going to be a continuing problem. And then third, and kind of relevant to the geopolitical discussion, is just get together to counter systemic threats like the activities of Russia and China. So this kind of does relate back to the geopolitics. How do we come together in various like-minded coalitions to support more effective joint attribution and collaboration with allies? There's a lot more in there, but those are the basic points.
Great, thank you. And I just posted that link to the chat. And to me, it was one of the first one. It was really the first report that I could think of that wasn't just talking about giving a framework about supply chain attacks, which I found to be very useful, but actually then included data set of here have been different kinds of supply chain attacks over the years. And we don't really get that many data sets in this place where that, it's usually just putting out ideas, right? It's a think tank, right? And then here it is, not just the ideas and the framework, but the actual data set itself. Okay, so hey, this is a panel, and we can't do this without questions in from the audience. And so I haven't seen any come in yet. So I do encourage those of you dialing in from home. Why do I feel like I'm on radio all of a sudden? Please do dial in with your questions. So moving on, Jeremy, if I can start with you, you've been in this business, you've been a hard computer scientist working on this for decades now, and I'm curious how you've seen the different kinds of incidents that you've responded to. And how that's helping you think about what's coming in the next year, right? Did you start on this and you're mostly worried about petty crime and that's been changing? And how do you think that your history there changes your perspective?
Well, I mean, I think certainly there's been a huge growth and evolution. I certainly remember, some earlier times when I first started in this field. I mean, the concept of things like drive-by exploitation, sort of visiting websites, and now you fast forward to the events that we've been talking about from the last couple of weeks here. I mean, that's just sort of a dramatic shift in sort of some of the things that folks begin to see. And I think to me that's some of the aspects that keep this field particularly interesting. It's hard to say that one day is very much like the next, but I mean, I think those are maybe some areas where we've sort of seen growth and change and sort of just what you deal with from a day in and day out perspective, as the threat vectors have certainly changed.
So we, as bad as SolarWinds was, this, potentially up to 18,000 customers got affected by this. Surely the number that were actively exploited is much less than that. But it was pretty bad. And yet, I still feel like we dodged a bullet, right? I mean, but for Putin being in a bad mood, perhaps they might have been quite a bit more aggressive. And it made me think of other potentially systemic issues that we've had, starting from the Morris worm in 1986 to Conficker and then in the 2000s, the age of the great worms. So hopefully we can stay ahead of that. So we're starting to get some questions in. So let me go start going to those. All right. Let's start with, I see one coming in on Fintech. And this has come up a lot. The work that Catherine Rosen, Trish Mosser, myself, Alex Wortman have done, we were looking at what are the dampeners, what are the amplifiers, the amps and damps on financial stability? What are the things that are going to help tamp down the crises? What are the things that are going to amp up the crises? And then there were some that we just didn't quite know which direction they were going to go. And to me, Fintech was one of those. And so be curious on the thoughts on Fintech. As we are doing more Fintech over the next 5 years, I would suspect accelerated by the pandemic. In your personal opinions, is Fintech likely to dampen cyber risk to financial stability because we are no longer having so many single points of failure? Because we are now having, for example, more opportunities and more places that we're doing clearing and settling. Or is it likely to amplify those risks? Because a lot of times this Fintech has been put in place specifically to bypass existing financial regulations. And that open question. Ellie, opinions on Fintech? In
Sure. Capacity? So, yeah, personal capacity here, of course. I think it's a very interesting question, and I think a lot of it will depend on the security controls that a given Fintech has in, place within their firm. But if the Fintech is, if a given firm is established to help, with a particular process or even bypass the process, right? And it's connected to a whole host of financial institutions and other firms within the sector, right? I mean, that does have the potential to amplify. But I think, again, it gets down to what are the specific controls that firm has in place, and how well do they manage their own risks, because it could be an amplifier. And we just have to sort of manage that and work through those challenges.
Okay.
I mean, I wonder in this space if one of the one of the challenges here is really sort of around the sort of market share, right? For something to come in and be such a disruptor that it becomes ubiquitous enough to cause that, I think, cascade effect, that impact broadly on financial stability that you sort of suggest as we look at kind of the risk that could be associated with a new player to that. I mean, it seems like a pretty significant uphill challenge to get and reach the level, just reflecting maybe on some of the conversations from the first panel, you know, around the size of some of these players in sort of the ecosystem here, and whether or not, you know, a fintech startup in a sea of fintechs is going to be something that could sort of reach the size and stature to really elevate that. But you know, I suppose we'll see as that continues to be a focus, perhaps accelerated by post-pandemic, as you suggest.
If I can go back to Ali for a second, because we had a question that I think is related to fintech generally from David Weisbrod in the Q&A, is looking specifically at cryptocurrency. And right, we wouldn't have had the ransomware scourge if it wasn't easily monetized using cryptocurrency. And so what is Treasury doing internationally, if you know, to try and say, like, do we want to crack down on cryptocurrency? Is this substantially happening? Is that largely just law enforcement and not on the finance sector? Are you familiar with those efforts?
Sure. So this is a little bit outside of you know, my particular wheelhouse within Treasury, but there is activity within the Group of Seven, the Financial Action Task Force, that another part of Treasury participates in, and they are looking specifically at cryptocurrency and other virtual currencies and what activities need to happen from an international perspective and from a regulatory perspective to help sort of get a better understanding of the way in which these are being leveraged, and then what actions can be taken to put a damper on the ability of threat actors and criminal actors to use cryptocurrencies and virtual currencies to, you know, to be able to monetize their criminal efforts.
Yeah, it really reminds me on this point, and Barry and Jeremy, please come off mute if you've got something that you want to add to the cryptocurrency question. There was great work that was done by Stefan Savage at UCSD and some collaborators a couple of years ago now that looked at the spam value chain, and they said, look, we can try and technically disrupt spam all we want, and we should continue doing that. But they went back and figured out, how are people making money from spam? How do the spammers get paid? And they traced it back to like 6 Eastern European banks. And so they said, boy, right, they're always going to change their technology. You know, we can stop them, but then they're going to come up with some new ways. But boy, United States Treasury is really good at figuring out how to go after foreign banks that are involved in illicit criminal activity. And so let's just go do that, because that's really easy for us. And it's really difficult for the spammers to try and come up with these new financial arrangements. And so this is work that we've been doing, with Dmitry Alperovich, one of the non-resident senior fellows, along with me at the Atlanta Council, to say, where can we try and disrupt these attackers in the normal places? And it would be interesting to see if there's anything there on crypto, anything more on can be done on the cryptocurrency side. Barry, we had one question in the chat from Craig Broderick that I really liked. And we've seen, his question is why the reluctance of government and market participants to focus more on offense on preventing cyber attacks. And, you know, there is some reluctance still, of course, especially if you're looking at market participants, if that means financial institutions here. But I think the last 4 years, we've seen a significant change within the US government. And I would say maybe even the Australians and the Brits also, of saying, no, we do need to, you know, the best offense is a good offense, to paraphrase General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I was wondering if you might talk to that, and where do you see maybe that happening changing over the next few years?
Yeah, Jay, I think I would start that conversation with your excellent Zorek report from several years ago, which you put in the chat, where you identified sort of 2 key variables. You know, the extent of secure internet connectivity or insecure, and the extent of private sector dominance versus government. And I think it's pretty clear that the trends since then have been toward dominant government activity and much more insecurity, whereas, as you put it, security is a luxury good in some, in some ways. I don't want to go too far, but I think that's true. And so I think you do have, pretty predominant government activity and security activity. The most recent, or at least prominent, government offensive effort was, to protect the election, both the midterm and the recent one, where I think it was pretty successful, if I'm getting the technicals correct, against a Russian entity that did some pretty significant damage in the 2016 election. So that's one case where it was used not for financial exchanges, but for other exchanges. I do see that happening a bit more and more as the instability, as the amplitude of the instability, heightens, and as people turn to government roles. But there's private sector capacity as well. So I think it has to be done in partnership. It's my initial reaction to a pretty big question, and we don't know how it's going to go forward.
Yeah, and certainly if we were looking at, say, when the attacks happened against Iran, like what was that, 2010, 2011, Cyber Command didn't have any real ability to respond, like they didn't have the force structure to respond. And it wasn't clear they had the authorities either from the president or from Congress that might have been treated as covert action, for example. And I think that's substantially changed now, 10 years on, right? If, say, Iran were going to do an attack on the finance sector, right, there are parts of Cyber Command that are ready to respond. Congress has made clear they're encouraged to respond, not to take the point too far. And now with the ARC, those banks would have a way to say, hey, we need help right now, Cyber Command, can someone please come to our help? I've got the last, I'm going to do some final question, but let me just pause and see if Alexander or Jeremy had anything they want to add to that point. Okay, I'm going to finish with the question, which I found extremely practical, from Stu and Camargo, who had a good question yesterday as well. I'm going to ask this one to Jeremy because it's a very focused operational question. So Jeremy, if you can answer that, and if you have any final comments, and then we'll go to Barry and Allie for any final comments or any final thoughts to finish off the panel. Stuens was very operationally focused, right? Look, given the changes that are coming, actually let me change this, right? I was largely like Jeremy in incident response, right? That's how I came up that in cyber threat intelligence, right? I was a responder. And so when I was a responder, I helped set up the very first Goldman Sachs cert. Response meant a certain thing. It was responding to the big worms like SQL Slammer, NIMDA, Code Red. It generally didn't mean intrusions. We didn't have ransomware. There weren't really a whole lot of denial of service attacks even at that point. What incident response means has changed significantly since I was back in the game. And so Jeremy, to Stuen's point, how do you think incident response teams are going to have to change as we're now seeing more of the supply chain attacks, second, third party risk? Does that change how you're planning, how you're organizing your team, how you're hiring, how you're budgeting?
There's a lot to unpack there, but maybe even sort of connecting some of our earlier questions and conversations around technology and sort of what the future holds in this space. I mean, so many things certainly early in my career, and you probably remember these from early SOC days, was sort of manually driven human interaction, and we've rapidly advanced that with EDR capabilities and so forth, that really provide sort of automation and ubiquitous access inside an enterprise environment to really kind of close that that chain. I think for enterprises, I think sort of one thing that's interesting, and I think this connects sort of back to the conversation that we've talked about from a ransomware perspective. So much of this boils down to basics in many ways. I know we get excited about some of the supply chain things and the complexities there. Those are incredibly difficult things to identify, as we sort of see from the recent headlines. But in the space of ransomware, and I would say sort of broadly from a security perspective, so much of this boils back down to sort of some of the basics and fundamentals that we absolutely have to focus on getting right. This is about sort of just that good cyber hygiene. We talk about backup systems, business continuity, recovery plans, exercises to validate these things, not just from a technical perspective, but from a business perspective. If I sort of think of an analogy, you go to the dentist for your routine checkup. They might remind you should floss every day, or maybe they tell you how great you've been doing because you have been flossing daily. But we just sort of still continue to struggle with some of these, sort of fundamental basics as a sector, and perhaps as most enterprises, that I think we can stand to focus and make sure we get those right as we look to face down some of these more significant and challenging threats as we look forward.
Great, thank you very much. Barry, any final comments?
Yeah, I just think you keyed me with your history of being a responder. I do think it would behoove the sector to do as much scenario planning and foresight and anticipation of shocks and then resilience as possible, because we're just in different terrain here in this decade, and it's probably going to get bumpier. So I like to say we're very good at not being able to predict the next thing. So we should try to broaden the portfolio and hedge a little bit against a few surprises that are almost certainly coming within the next five years.
I love that point, Barry, and it's one of the things that we talked about in the Zurich report of saying agility is a general purpose investment. In cybersecurity, so many of the investments we do, right? We see new attack X, so we buy an anti-X widget that's going to help us on that. And that just ends up adding the complexity to the environment, like doing exercises, right? Practicing those exercises, doing your practicing getting everyone together and doing operational collaboration. That agility is general purpose. It almost doesn't matter what the catastrophe is, if you've done that investment into agility. And so that's a fabulous point. Al, you get the last word. What are your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Jay. Just to build on this last point from Barry and yourself, we have the Hamilton Series Exercise Program at Treasury. We participate in interagency cross-sector exercises like DHS's Cyberstorm. There's always an opportunity for financial institutions and other industry groups to participate in those. We welcome that participation because you're right, preparedness is key. And working through all those mechanisms ahead of time will help us when we need to respond to incidents. So engage with us, Hamilton Series. It's a great opportunity. And you can participate through the FSIC, which is the Financial Sector Services Coordinating Council.
I'm sorry, do you mind, some of the folks just might not be as familiar with Hamilton Series. Could you do 1 or 2 minutes just on kind of the background and some of the, what's up? It's such an important
Sure,
point.
Absolutely. So the Hamilton Series is it's Treasury's cyber exercise program. We've had this in place since about 2014. It's a way for Treasury, along with our partners and the federal financial regulator community, law enforcement, DHS, and the private sector to come together to work through, a scenario, talk through how the different participants would respond, what the actions that they would be taking, from a government perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from a private sector perspective, so that they can have a shared understanding of what incident response looks like, what the expectations are, what the roles and responsibilities are, and so that you have a sense of who to call and who you need to engage with in the event that something does happen to your firm. They have been largely tabletop exercises, but we are moving into holding functional exercises as we move into 2021. So there's an opportunity here to have them more sort of realistic and to work through sort of actual response, you know, as you move throughout, you know, a day or multi-day scenario.
Great, thank you. And there are so many other good questions that we didn't get to, for example, looking at finance sector and healthcare and lessons there. So apologies, we didn't get to all of them, but we are out of time. And so first, thanks to the panelists for just really stimulating conversation about what we might be expecting over the next 5 years. Look, we already in cybersecurity, in financial stability, had a really hard job over the last 5 years. And it felt so many times, I'm sure on both sides, that maybe we were just starting to get a good grip on this and we were starting to understand the problem. And then we had 2020. And I'm sure many of us are feeling like we gained 2 feet, but we slid back another 10. And so we've got a hard job ahead of us, but thank you very much for everything that all of you are doing, regardless of where you're sitting, whether you're currently a student, whether you're in a financial institution, a regulator, a think tank, academia. Thank you for the hard work. We are all going to have to put our shoulders to this burden if we're going to get through. The attackers have so many advantages. And one of the phrases that I liked from Chris Inglis from the Cyberspace Solarium report is, wouldn't it be great if they no longer have to beat one of us, the adversaries have to beat all of us. And so when we start getting, when we're together like this and important events like today, we are starting to make it all of us. And so thank you very much for that. My thanks to, again, the panelists here, to my colleague at Columbia, Trish Mosser, to Anna Kovner and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for their support. Also to Jen Gennaro on my team, as well as Dan Sorik, Yerke, Kadyrov, and other students that were involved. Hopefully when you see that they were involved in cyber risk to financial stability on their resume, you'll know exactly what amazing students they are, and you will be ready to give them jobs. We are going to be posting additional slides and references onto the website for today, which we have posted. It also has the full bios of the participants. So please do check back at that site if you're interested in the links. Of course, in the coming days, we'll be putting up a little bit more information on the panel. Of course, did want to thank Jason Whitty of JP Morgan Chase, Art Lindo for their excellent comments. And we are certainly hoping that we are going to see you over the next year as we continue the series on the state of the field on cyber risk to financial stability. With that, thank you very much. And we've gone slightly over time. Take care.